I was really surprised when last month stats came out for the user rate when it came to ascendancy classes, and Pathfinder sat at a pretty low 3.3% compared to the other classes that had a much higher rate of usage. And so that kind of built my curiosity and made me ask myself, like, why is it so low? Like, why aren't people playing this character? So I spent a good 30-40 hours dabbling with it, and I realized this character is actually really good, like really slept on. There's a lot of potential in this character, a lot of great damage output, but it does require a little bit of fine tuning. So let's go into why I'm enjoying this build right now. One of the main reasons why I decided to pick up Pathfinder was because I'm a huge fan of damage over time, and ailments play such an integral role in Path of Exile when used correctly. And because Pathfinder focuses so heavily on those areas, most notably things like poison and bleeding, and then when you throw in things like ignition, it's just damage over time consistently, and that really gives me a feeling of true control because I don't have to always engage in a fight. That's because the damage over time does all the work for me. And so as long as I'm able to maintain my flash charges, which I think admittedly was the caveat at first, because in order to really make the build work correctly, you have to have enough flash charges. Therefore, you don't run out of your mana. But I think once you're able to overcome that hurdle and you're able to obtain better equipment that has really good rolls, then I feel Pathfinder is super strong and the damage potential is really high, so long as you're able to really build into, as I mentioned earlier, your poisons, your bleeding, your ignitions, because that damage over time just continues to escalate to the point where boss battles become much easier for me. Dealing with hordes of monsters is a breeze compared to when I used to play, you know, just Mercenary alone or Stormweaver. I don't know, for me personally, it felt a bit slower to deal with certain enemies, whereas when I'm dealing with enemies now with Pathfinder, I have a much easier time just because of how much damage I'm doing and the magnitude of all the poison and the bleeding and the ignitions that just consistently build up over time to the point where I don't have to really commit as much. I felt like I had to commit a little bit harder in other builds, but because of all the DOT happening consistently, I was able to kind of sit back a little bit and just chuck my flask at enemies and, you know, be relatively safe and just focus more on my movement and positioning, and I was totally fine. But overall, so far, I think this build is extremely rewarding, and I really recommend it to anybody who's looking for a build that really plays into that fantasy of just a poison specialist, you know, the alchemist. It's a really good build that I think over time will only get better as the game progressively improves in terms of just skill gems, support gems, all that. So that being said, let's move on to the next point. Another fantastic reason why I chose Pathfinder was due to its barrier of entry being quite low, in that it's a very straightforward build to work with. The only caveat that I feel, and I mentioned this earlier, just came down to making sure that your equipment came with some degree of flask charges, because flasks play such a big role in Pathfinder that if you don't have those, it could really make your build somewhat slow and kind of imbalanced, right? But if you're able to successfully acquire all of the necessary rolls and flash charges, and then building into your skill tree to ensure all of that is concise and more consistent, then I think Pathfinder over time really shines, especially in the area of damage. And I mentioned earlier with damage over time being really slept on. I really do feel like poison and bleeding are two very integral ailments that people tend to overlook. But when you're, let's say you are in a battle against an enemy that's just chucking, you know, blood darts at you, or they're shooting poison darts at you, just look at how much damage you take from them. It's really, really high. So I figured, hey, you know what? If they can do that much damage to me, then I figured I can do the same thing to them if I build into it. And that's how I feel now. I feel like with all the investment I've placed into the build thus far, I've had so much more satisfaction out of the build, but also more success overall in terms of just the speed at which I move. Compared to when I used Stormweaver or just Mercenary alone, I felt like the speed at which I would be moving, or at least like clearing enemies and clearing hordes, it felt slower. But because I have my flasks and I have my bow, I can kind of play a close range and a long range as well, because the flask can be really great to just slam on the floor. It spreads the AoE and it causes damage. And then of course you have your bow itself that can really deal damage from afar. So it kind of gave me a nice, well-rounded build, which allowed me to play with a little bit more freedom. And I found it easier to deal with bosses since I don't have to always overcommit to being too close. And because of the damage over time, I can just sit back and relax watching their health bar just melt, because all that DOT is just seeping into their HP bar. So that was also another great treat. And another great reason why, again, I feel like the build is really underrated, and I feel like more people should give Pathfinder a try. Now that we have more gems coming into the game and endgame being a lot more just fine-tuned and refined for players, this is the best time to jump in and try the character. Now, I really would like to make an in-depth guide on my build, just to give you a little bit more detail and analysis as to why I've chosen certain things. So if you want to see that, make sure to comment in the comment section below. And of course, look out for more Pathfinder content on this channel. I think I'll be sticking with Pathfinder for the time being, and I might try Huntress and just combine both that, you know, Pathfinder and Huntress together. But look forward to that video in the near future once all that drops in the new update. Until then, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you made it this far. And as always, new warriors, stay strong, keep fighting, and may the force be with you all, always. See you next time. Enjoy Pathfinder. Take care.